Hello and welcome back. In this video we're going to take a slightly sideways step and look at a few techniques that we can use in Lightroom to make our life simpler and to make our workflow more efficient. So what we have here are basically 10 simple tips, some very simple, some a little bit more complicated, that will help you no end in your workflow in sorting and finding images to edit in Lightroom. And the first one we're going to talk about is a very basic one in the Develop module. When we go into Lightroom, in the Develop module, by default you might find that the right hand panel where you make all the adjustments is quite narrow, and if you start to try and apply some adjustments to your image, you struggle to get a little bit of a fine adjustment with the sliders. The simple answer here is we can just take that right hand panel and expand it quite considerably, so that now you have a much greater area to use to make your adjustments over. That's a very simple tip, and it will stay there. Once you've set that width of that column, it will stay there forever as you go back and forth from Lightroom. So that's tip number one. Now, tip number two is a very simple one that applies right across Lightroom and into Photoshop, and that is to use the Alt key or the Option key on a Mac in conjunction with sliders to give you added features. A simple one here is, if we're looking at our overall exposure on this image, if I hold down the Alt key while I adjust the exposure, you'll see that as I move towards the right hand side, by holding down the Alt key, you will start to see a live overlay of where your image is being clipped to white. Obviously we wouldn't be adjusting our image all that way, but if you want to just see where it's going to start to clip to white, hold down the Alt key, move the exposure slider, and of course you can also use this triangular push in button on the top, but it's very hard to see where it's going to clip. There's a little bit of clipping down here, but you'd be hard pressed to see it. So if we just use the Alt key, we get a much clearer view of where it's going to start to clip. And likewise, if we are looking at our blacks and white sliders, hold down Alt, we can see if we slide our black slider, we're clipping a lot of the image to black, or we can move it across so that we're just getting a minor amount of clipping in the shadow details, and therefore we've adjusted our exposure. And bearing in mind that of course exposure in Lightroom is a misnomer, it's the middle tones primarily that we're adjusting here, so that we would tend to want to adjust the whites independently of the blacks. And you'll see there that once we've done that, we can move the middle tones, and you'll see the center part of the histogram move when we adjust the exposure. Adobe sometimes gets things a little wrong, and it should be called midtones, not exposure, and we can adjust our overall midtones once we've set our black and white points accordingly. So the tip here, use the Alt key for this, and again once we go down into the detail panel and apply some sharpening, let's just click on the center part of the image. This is my home of Sydney, and one of the iconic parts of Sydney is the center point, or now called the Westfields Tower. When we apply sharpening to the image, it's a little bit hard to see what we're doing. Typically you'd want to provide enough sharpening to render the fine detail, but then we want to mask the image. We don't want to apply sharpening across the board. If we have our masking set at 0, everything in the image will be sharpened, even areas of blank sky and blank white cloud, and so we don't want to sharpen those. By holding down the Alt key, you are applying a live mask to the image, and so you can adjust the amount of masking until you get just masking along the edges of areas of difference in tone. And of course you can adjust the amount of detail or fine detail brought out in the image in the same way. So using the Alt key on many adjustments in Lightroom and Photoshop gives you access to added features. Now for tip number 3, we're going to go back to the Library module and look at ways that we can refine our selection of images as we search for something within our collection. And if you look here on this collection of my images, I have 90,000 odd images here, and if I'm looking for a particular image, unless I know where it was taken, which is one way we can initially sort. Let's say that we wanted an image taken in the Arctic in 2018. I click on the folder rather than the total number of images. So from 90,000 images, I'm instantly just looking at a collection of about 3,200 images. But I can refine this further by using the metadata to sort through the images that I'm looking for. And if your selection criteria is not available, use the / key on your keyboard to show your library filters. And here we're going to choose metadata, and I'm just going to reset this to none. We'll go back in, and you've got a whole series of columns here. By default, your version of Lightroom will probably not be showing all of these, but you can add columns and you can set these as you wish to sort for different criteria. Now, for instance, this last one here is set at the ISO speed of the image, but I could choose any one of a number of different options down here. I could choose what aperture I used if I was looking for a particular set of criteria, and these are all of the different apertures that I've made images at within this collection of images. So you can see that there's quite a lot of different ways you can sort for different ways that you've taken your image. I'll go back to ISO speed, and if you wanted to add another column, you can simply come across to this little menu bar over on the right hand side, click on that, select to add a column, and a further column will be added, and where it'll initially be blank and show none, but if you click on that, you can come down and, for instance, choose, well, in this case I don't have map location, but I could choose whether I use the flash, I could choose aperture, shutter speed, focal length, etc., etc. Many different ways we could do that. And if you don't want to have that column, you could just say remove this column, make sure you selected that one, and for instance, if I don't want that ISO speed anymore, I can remove that column. And each time you remove a column, these other ones will expand. Let's go back and put that column back in, because I think I liked the option of looking at my ISO speed. So let's just say these photographs are all taken at one particular time, but let's say I just wanted to look at images taken with this particular lens, which is a 150 to 600 lens, and it looks like only one. What about this one? A whole different range of images. Or if I went back to this particular lens, there's a whole lot of other images taken during that period of time. And let's say, well, I only want to look at my raw files, not my Photoshop processed images. And if I wanted to look at a particular shutter speed, by clicking all of these different criteria, I can refine my selection down to just a few images. So using the metadata that's available from the image information, you can use it to sort and find images very quickly. And just remember, once you've done all of that and found what you want, just go back and click on none, so that you can then view all of your images again. If you've been through and set a number of criteria and then you go back in looking for a particular image and you can't see it, just make sure that you've reset that to none. So that's our tip number 3. Tip number 4 is probably the most important thing that you'll do in Lightroom, and that is using collections to group images together. Now, in Lightroom, on the left-hand panel, once you've scrolled through all of your image folders, you will come down to a folder called Collections. And by default, it will have a series of smart collections which Lightroom automatically puts together. And these are like a shopping list of all of the items within your catalog that fulfill a particular criteria. For instance, in the Smart Collections option, anything that you've nominated with a red label in your image collection will appear in this Smart Collection. You don't have to do anything, it adds it to the collection automatically. For instance, and if anything you give 5 stars to, will automatically be added to the collection. And so as you go through your images initially, as you download them and sort them, anything that you give a 5-star rating to will automatically be added to the smart collection. And you can make your own smart collections by setting up a criteria, such as I wanted to choose anything that had been taken with the flash for a particular reason. And so I could set that up as a smart collection, and it will automatically filter every image in my collection that's been used with the flash. And for instance, I made another one where I said, well, I only want to look at my Photoshop files that I've decided are worth 5 stars, and here we are. So they're smart collections, and these can be set up as an automatic collection, but probably the thing that you will use the most is just a normal collection, and that is a group of images. Let's just say I wanted a group of images for a presentation on using exposure, so I created a collection and then I've added a series of images to that. And how would we do that? Well, let's go back to where we were before, into our collection of images, our master folders, where we store all of our images. Let's go back to, well, let's go back and look at Iceland. Why not? What's wrong with Iceland? Let's just have a look here. Well, I just want to look at all of my Photoshop files that I took in Iceland, and I want to put a collection together. Let's say we're going to produce a book or a slideshow or something like that. I can just go through, initially select my folder that contains all of my images, and let's say I want to add some architectural images together for a particular collection. So with that image selected in my grid view, if I scroll down to all the way down to collections, and you'll see on the right hand side here a little plus symbol, click on that and you have the option to create a collection, and this is where you would create one of those smart collections, which we'll have a look at a little later. But let's say create a collection. What do I want to call it? Well, Lightroom's very helpful. By default it says we're going to call it collection. That's of absolutely no use whatsoever. So let's say we're going to call this Iceland buildings, and by default it will add the image that you've selected into that collection. Here we are. Here's our collection, Iceland buildings. It has one image in it. So if we scroll back up to where we started from, which was all the way back up here in Iceland, we have our Photoshop file selected, and now that we're back in this folder, if on the left hand side we just scroll down to where our collection is located, you'll see there's in this group there's quite a lot here, and Iceland buildings. Well, to make it easier for me to do this, I'll just come over here. This is another building image. I just click on that thumbnail, drag it across. You'll see the title highlighted, and release it, and now we have 2 images in there, and we can just go through and select our different images that we want to add to that collection. That's as difficult as it gets. We just have to find where we go to, what happened to it, Iceland buildings. There we go. Another new feature in the latest version of Lightroom is the option of being able to apply color labels to collections to make it easier to find. You'll see some of these are already been given colored labels. If I click on the title for the collection, right mouse click, and if I just want to add a color label, let's say we just want to make that yellow to make it stand out, we can see now that my collection has a yellow label, and there are 4 images that I've just dragged into it. Now the beauty of this is I can access the photograph here, or if I want to go back to my folder, if I right mouse click on the thumbnail and select go to the folder in library, I can see the same image in its folder in the library, and it is the same image. It's just a different way of referencing that image. And so let's just say we go through and we want to select a few more. Just make sure on the left hand side we've come back down to our collection, and we can just simply drag and drop. Here's my yellow label, I can see that quite clearly, and so I can just drag and drop and make my collection and build it up. And in particular, if you were producing something like a book or an audio visual, once you've got images in a collection such as this, you can reorder them at will. You can put them in any old order, so that if you're putting them together for a slideshow, you could work out a way that would work for you. Whereas in the library module, in the folders, you can only select by file name and so forth. So let's go back to the folder in the library, and this is our collection of images, and you'll see here by default you've got an option of either sorting it by file name, capture time, and various other things, but you have trouble then getting it to be in any other order. But in a collection you can play around with it to your heart's content. And the beauty of this is also, because it is the same image, if you select a particular image and want to re-edit that image, it will update in both locations because it is the same image. So that's a really powerful way that we can use collections to compile images for a particular project or discussion. Now, before we leave collections, we should just have a quick look at how we create a smart collection, because these can be also very helpful in setting up an automatic way to filter images for you. So let's just go back up to the top here where we have our smart collections, and we do the same thing. We go into add a collection. This time we don't need to have anything selected. We just click on create, this time a smart collection. And again, Lightroom is very helpful in saying, well, we're going to call this a smart collection. Well, you need to decide what you're going to do. I'm going to make a collection here that filters out all of my particular images that are meeting certain criteria, and it's going to be images that are 5-star and labeled blue, and that happen to be Photoshop format files. And you'll see here that I've already got some criteria set here, but if we just delete these and we'll start again, normally we would be starting with no criteria selected, and you can choose to make it inside a collection set, but no, I'm going to make this just a normal smart collection. And you have the options here that you can just set the criteria. Firstly, you can decide whether it needs to match all or any or none of the criteria or rules that you set. Well, in this case, you'd normally select all of the rules. And firstly, I want to select anything that's got a rating of greater or equal to, or you can have is not, is less than, etc., etc. But let's say greater than equal to, and in this case, we can give it, say, 5 stars. So that's the first criteria. I want all images that I've decided have 5 stars. And the second thing I want to add by clicking the little plus symbol over here is another criteria. In this case, I want it to be anything that actually has a label color that is going to be is or is not. In this case, I want everything that is labeled blue. So now I'm filtering by anything that's 5 stars and that also has a blue label. And finally, I'm going to say, well, I want to just choose anything that I've already processed, and that is that I have a file type. And in this case, we have the choice file name or type. We want a file type, and then is or is not. Well, we want to choose is. And in this instance, I'm going to say I just want to choose anything that's a Photoshop document. And I could go on, I could add more criteria, and as you can see, as you select these, you're narrowing down the collection. I'm not going to make let's say, well, look, all right, let's say capture date is after, and of course Lightroom speaks in American dates, so we have to work let's say 2015, and that is the criteria. Now that I've done that, I've got no photographs in that option. So let's just go back, select that collection, right mouse click, edit the smart collection, takes me back in here. Let's not worry about the date, let's remove that date, and then we'll click on save. And now here's my collection. 5-star Photoshop file and blue criteria. And so this will, every time you add a 5-star image that has a Photoshop and meets those criteria, it will automatically be added to that. And as we just saw, we could go back in and we could edit that collection. So if we right mouse click here, edit the smart collection, I think I made a mistake. I don't really want the blue labels, I want the red labels, or the yellow labels, or the green labels. Let's say green. I can just go in, change that criteria, save that again, and now all I'm seeing is the ones that I've labeled green. And obviously my name of my smart collection, 5-star blue, is no longer correct, so I can right mouse click here and just rename that collection 5-star green, and then rename it. And every time any image that I create fits those criteria, it will be added to that smart collection. So that's another way you can use the metadata and the power of Lightroom to refine selections for you. In part 2 of this video, we'll look at some further enhancement and processing tips that will speed up your workflow. I'll see you again soon.